Vampire King installed camera to watch his paralyzed triplets. What he saw the maid doing shocked him. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. The Vampire King, a centuries-old ruler with unimaginable power, had seen many things in his long life, but nothing like his triplets. Born with a mysterious curse that left them paralyzed and unable to speak, the king's world had turned upside down. Despite his incredible strength and influence, there was nothing he could do to break the curse that had taken away the future of his beloved children. As a father, his heart was heavy with guilt and helplessness. For 50 years, doctors, healers, and even powerful magic users had tried and failed to heal his children. No one could explain the mysterious affliction that had struck them. The Vampire King, in his desperation, decided to take matters into his own hands. He installed cameras in their room, hidden from sight, to observe them when he was not around. But what he saw through those cameras would leave him shocked, questioning everything he thought he knew about the situation. The maid, a young woman hired to care for his children, had been with them for several years. She was kind, gentle, and dedicated to her work. To the king, she was just another caretaker who followed the rules. But as he watched her through the hidden cameras, he saw something strange. Late one night, as the moonlight cast eerie shadows through the castle windows, the maid entered the room of the triplets, her footsteps light but determined. She knelt beside the eldest child, her face softening as she whispered something. The king leaned forward, intrigued by her actions. She had always been so professional, so proper, but what he saw next would shatter everything he had known. The maid gently touched the triplet's hand, her fingers brushing against his cold skin. The camera captured the moment when the child's fingers twitched, the faintest sign of life. The Vampire King's heart raced. How could this be? His children had not moved in years, and yet here she was, seemingly making a connection. But what was even more shocking was the ritualistic gesture she made next. She closed her eyes and muttered a strange, ancient incantation. The king froze. He had never heard that language before, but it sounded familiar, like something from his own forgotten past. What was the maid doing? The triplets' breathing grew deeper, and for a moment, the king believed he was witnessing a miracle. But there was more to this story, something darker, something hidden beneath the surface. As the maid continued her whispered chant, the camera revealed more. She looked around the room, as if ensuring no one was watching. Then, with trembling hands, she reached into the pocket of her apron and pulled out a small, old object. The king squinted, his vampire vision honing in on the item. It was a locket that had once belonged to his late wife. His breath caught in his throat. What was the maid's connection to the royal family? Why did she have such an item? The king, now consumed by a mixture of confusion and anger, made a decision. He would confront her. He would find out what she was hiding. His children's fate was tied to this woman, and he would not rest until he knew the truth. But little did he know, the truth would be far more shocking than he could ever have imagined. The Vampire King could no longer ignore what he had seen through the cameras. His mind raced as he replayed the footage of the maid whispering an ancient incantation to his paralyzed triplets, a gesture he had not expected from someone so ordinary. He could not shake the image of her holding the locket, his late wife's locket. How did she have it? Why had she chosen this moment, this night, to reveal something so secret? His heart, usually as cold as the night, pounded in his chest. He had to confront her. The next day, he waited until the moon hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the halls of the castle. The air was thick with tension, and the atmosphere inside the castle felt heavier than ever. His children had made the smallest of movements, a flicker of hope that he clung to desperately. But now the maid had become the key to unlocking the mystery, and with it, his world was about to unravel in ways he never imagined. When the maid arrived for her evening duties, she was unaware of the Vampire King's presence. The king watched her carefully, his amber eyes narrowed with suspicion. She moved with grace and purpose, the usual quiet steps of someone used to working in the shadows. She entered the triplets' room without a word, and the door clicked shut behind her. The vampire king stood still, every sense heightened. He waited. For what? He wasn't sure, but he knew it would be soon. His patience stretched thin as he heard the familiar sounds of her tending to the children. She spoke softly, the words muffled, but something in her tone made the king pause. It was not the gentle care she had always shown. There was something deeper this time. He approached the door silently, his footsteps barely audible against the cold stone floor. He pressed his ear to the door, straining to hear more. Her words grew clearer. She was chanting again. The vampire king's heart skipped a beat. He had to stop this. His instincts kicked in, and he couldn't hold back any longer. He threw open the door, and there she was, kneeling beside the eldest triplet. She looked up in surprise, her eyes wide with shock. She hadn't expected him to be there. "What are you doing?" The king's voice was low but filled with power. The maid froze, her hands trembling as she withdrew from the child's side. She opened her mouth to speak, but faltered. The words caught in her throat, and she looked down, avoiding the king's piercing gaze. I didn't mean to," she stammered. "I thought." She hesitated again, unsure how to explain. The king's gaze softened just for a moment, but the question remained. Why was she doing this? "Explain," he demanded, his voice firm but not cruel. The maid took a deep breath, her shoulders slumping in defeat. "I never meant for you to find out," she said quietly, almost to herself. "But they're your children, your majesty. I couldn't just sit by and watch them suffer." The king's eyes narrowed. "What do you mean?" "Your children. They're cursed," she said, her voice trembling. "But they are not beyond saving." The vampire king stared at her, disbelief flooding his mind. He had sought every remedy, every healer, but nothing had worked. How could this simple maid know something he didn't? The maid continued, her eyes downcast. "When I was young, I was told that one day I would be the one to break the curse, to heal what was broken. I didn't understand it at first, but when I saw your children, I knew I had to help." The king's mind raced as he tried to process what she was saying. He had heard legends of curses before, of bloodlines tied to fate, but he had never believed in them. And yet, here was this woman, claiming that she could heal his children, who had been suffering for so long, trapped in their own bodies. "Why did you wait?" he asked, his voice quieter now, searching for answers. "Why not tell me sooner?" The maid looked up at him, her eyes full of sorrow. "I couldn't. I knew what it would mean. If I revealed myself, if you knew who I truly was, everything would change." The king's brow furrowed. "Who are you?" She swallowed hard, gathering her courage. "I am the descendant of the witch who cursed your bloodline. I was chosen to break it. But the curse is strong. It has been passed down for generations. I had to wait until the time was right. And now, I believe it is." The vampire king felt a chill creep over him. His family's history was filled with secrets and shadows, but this was a truth he had never imagined. The maid, his caretaker, his children's protector, was linked to the curse that had haunted his bloodline for centuries. "So, you knew," the king whispered, stepping closer. "You knew all along." She nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "I did, but I couldn't do it alone. I need your help." The king was silent, processing everything she had told him. His thoughts were a whirlwind. The maid's words held weight, but could he trust her? Could he trust that she could truly break the curse? His mind screamed at him to be careful, to not fall for her lies. But his heart told him otherwise. He saw the sincerity in her eyes, the love she had for his children, and he saw the same desperation he had felt all these years. He took a deep breath. His decision made. "Then we do this together," he said, his voice resolute. "You and I, we will end this curse once and for all." The maid looked up at him, her face a mixture of relief and gratitude. "Thank you, your majesty. You don't know how much this means to me." "I do," he replied, his voice softening. "I know." With that, they both turned to the triplets, whose fate was now tied to their shared mission. The king knew that this would not be easy. There would be obstacles, dangers, and sacrifices ahead. But for the first time in years, he felt hope. And that was something he had not felt in a long, long time. The vampire king's heart raced with a mixture of hope and doubt. He had made a decision to trust the maid, the woman who had been caring for his children for years, and now, she was telling him that she could break the curse that had haunted their bloodline for generations. But as he stood there in the dimly lit room, surrounded by the quiet breaths of his children, a sense of foreboding still lingered. What if this was all just another illusion? What if he had placed his trust in the wrong person? The maid, standing beside him, seemed to sense his uncertainty. She turned to him, her face soft but serious. "I understand your hesitation, your majesty. But I assure you, I can do this. I was born to do this." The king looked at her, his amber eyes filled with a mixture of disbelief and longing. He had lived so long without hope that the idea of it now felt almost foreign. "How?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "How do you plan to break the curse?" The maid took a deep breath, her fingers brushing against the locket that she had hidden for so many years. "It's not just the curse that keeps your children bound," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "It's a bond that runs deeper than blood, deeper than magic. It's a connection that was forged centuries ago, between your family and the witch who cursed you. Only by severing that bond, by understanding the pain that binds you together, can we free your children." The king's mind raced, trying to comprehend what she was saying. A connection forged by the witch? A bond that could be severed? It all seemed so distant, so impossible. And yet, the maid's words held a strange truth to them. "What do we need to do?" he asked, his voice steady despite the storm of thoughts in his mind. The maid stepped closer to him, her eyes locked on his with unwavering determination. "We need to confront the source of the curse. The witch's power is still here, hidden away in the castle. We need to find it, face it, and break it once and for all." The vampire king stared at her, the weight of her words sinking in. A part of him wanted to dismiss it all as nonsense, to walk away and forget about the curse. But another part of him, a part that had long been buried under centuries of grief and pain, wanted to believe her. His children, his precious triplets, had suffered enough. They deserved a chance to live, to grow, to be free from the curse that had kept them trapped in their own bodies for so long. He had to do this. For them. "Then we find this source," the king said, his voice resolute. "We end this. Together." The maid nodded, a small but hopeful smile crossing her face. Together. And so, the vampire king and the maid began their journey to uncover the secrets that had been hidden within the castle for centuries. As they ventured deeper into the castle's labyrinthine halls, the atmosphere grew heavier, colder. The ancient stones seemed to whisper as if the very walls were aware of their mission. They came to a forgotten door, one that had been sealed for generations. The king placed his hand on the cold, rusted handle, feeling the magic that lay dormant within. This was it. The source of the curse was behind this door. He turned to the maid, his eyes searching hers. "Are you ready?" The maid nodded, her expression one of quiet determination. "Yes, let's end this." With a deep breath, the king turned the handle and pushed the door open. The room inside was dark, the air thick with the smell of age and dust. But as they stepped inside, something in the air shifted. A cold wind blew through the room, carrying with it a faint voice. The king's heart skipped a beat. He recognized the voice. It was the witch's voice. She had been waiting for them. "You think you can undo what has been done?" the voice whispered, its tone mocking. "You think you can break the bond that binds you to me?" The king stepped forward, his eyes narrowing. "We will, and we will free my children." The voice laughed, a sound that sent chills down the king's spine. "You cannot. The curse is stronger than you know. It is woven into your very blood, your very soul. You cannot escape it." The maid stepped forward, her face calm but resolute. "We will find a way," she said, her voice steady. "And we will break the curse. For the sake of your children." There was a long pause, the air thick with tension. The witch's voice seemed to vanish, replaced by an eerie silence. But the king and the maid did not waver. They had come this far, and they would not stop now. As the room seemed to grow colder, the maid reached out and touched the walls, her fingers tracing the ancient symbols etched into the stone. "This is it," she whispered. "This is where the curse began." The king stepped forward, his eyes scanning the room. He could feel the presence of the witch, her magic lingering in the shadows. But he also felt something else, a connection, deep within himself, that seemed to echo with the maid's touch. They were connected in some way, connected to the magic that bound his children. And for the first time in a long while, the king felt a flicker of hope. It was small, barely a spark, but it was there. "Let's do this," he said, his voice steady and filled with resolve. For my children. For our future. With that, the maid stepped forward, her fingers glowing with a faint, otherworldly light. Together, they would break the curse. Together, they would change everything. The vampire king stood still, watching as the maid's fingers traced the symbols etched into the ancient stone walls of the forgotten room. The air was thick with magic, and the presence of the curse felt almost palpable, like a heavy weight pressing down on him. He could feel it in his bones, the same dark energy that had bound his children for so long. The maid's touch glowed faintly, a light so soft it was almost imperceptible. But the king could feel the power within her. The power that had been dormant for centuries, waiting to be awakened. The room seemed to hum with anticipation, as if it, too, was waiting for something to change. This is where it began, the maid whispered. The witch's magic, the curse, it all started in this room. And this is where it ends. The vampire king looked at her, his heart heavy with uncertainty. And how do we break it? He asked, his voice low. The maid turned to face him, her expression steady and filled with resolve. We have to sever the bond, the one that ties your bloodline to the witch. But to do that, we need to uncover the truth, everything that was hidden, everything that was kept from you. The king's mind raced. What truth had been hidden from him? What had he missed all these years? His eyes searched the room, scanning the walls for answers. The symbols, the markings, everything about this place felt ancient, filled with secrets that had been buried for far too long. What do we need to do? He asked, his voice tinged with impatience. The maid stepped forward, her hands still glowing with that faint light. She placed her palm against the wall, her fingers aligning with the symbols. We need to open the door to the past, she said softly. We need to connect with the magic that was used to bind your bloodline. Only then will we understand how to break it. The king's gaze darkened. What are you asking of me? He demanded. The maid's eyes met his, and for a moment, they shared an unspoken understanding. I'm asking you to trust me, she said. I'm asking you to face the truth, no matter how painful it may be. The curse is not just a magic that was cast upon your children. It is a reflection of something deeper, something that has been passed down through your bloodline. We have to face that truth if we want to free them. The vampire king felt a cold chill run through him. The truth. It was a word he had avoided for so long. He had buried his past, his memories, his regrets. But now, standing in this room with the maid, he realized that he could no longer hide from it. He had to face it. I will trust you, he said, his voice heavy with the weight of centuries. But you must promise me one thing. The maid raised an eyebrow. What is it? She asked. That you will not let me lose my children, he said quietly. I have already lost too much. I cannot lose them too. The maid nodded, her expression filled with empathy. I won't let you lose them. We will break this curse, together. With those words, the room seemed to shift. The air grew colder, and the walls seemed to breathe with life. The vampire king felt the weight of the magic surrounding him, pressing down on him, urging him to move forward. He stepped closer to the maid, his resolve hardening. Let's begin, he said. The maid nodded, and with a deep breath, she reached for the wall once more. As her fingers touched the stone, the symbols on the walls began to glow, faint at first, then growing brighter with each passing second. The room seemed to pulse with energy, the magic within it awakening. The king could feel it, too. His heart raced, his senses heightened as the power in the room began to grow. We're almost there, the maid said, her voice barely audible over the growing hum of energy. We need to connect with the magic that binds your bloodline. Let it flow through you. The vampire king closed his eyes, his mind focused on the task ahead. He reached out, his fingers brushing against the maid's. The moment they touched, a surge of power shot through him. It was as if the very essence of his bloodline was awakening, and he could feel the curse in every fiber of his being. He gasped, his breath coming in ragged bursts as memories he had long forgotten began to surface. He saw flashes of his ancestors, their faces twisted in anguish as they struggled with the same curse that had plagued him. He saw the witch, her dark magic swirling around them, binding them to her will. And then, he saw something else, a figure standing in the shadows, watching him with cold, calculating eyes. Who are you? The king whispered, his voice barely audible. The figure did not respond. Instead, it raised its hand, and the darkness around it seemed to grow, consuming everything in its path. The king tried to move, to break free from the grip of the curse, but he was powerless against it. The darkness was too strong. Just as he thought he would be consumed by it, a light flashed in front of him. The maid's hand glowed brightly, pulling him back from the edge. "Focus," she said, her voice steady. "You're stronger than this." With her guidance, the king found his strength once more. He focused on the light, on the warmth that radiated from the maid's touch. Slowly, the darkness began to recede, fading into the shadows from which it came. The curse was weakening, and the king could feel it. The bond was beginning to unravel. But the fight was far from over. The room grew even colder, and the walls seemed to tremble with the intensity of the magic. The king's eyes widened. "It's not over," he said, his voice strained. The maid's grip tightened on his hand. "No," she said, "but we're getting closer. We just need a little more time." Time was something the vampire king did not have. But for his children, for his bloodline, he would fight until the very end. The vampire king stood with a deep, steady breath, his eyes locked on the maid's glowing hand, the magic pulsing around them. The energy in the room had shifted once again, darker now, more intense. The curse was weakening, but its final hold was not going to break so easily. The king felt the strain on his body, the connection to the magic pulling at him, threatening to overwhelm his senses. But he would not stop. Not when his children's futures were on the line. Not when there was a chance to finally end the torment that had consumed his family for so long. The walls of the chamber seemed to close in around them as the maid's chant grew louder. Her hands trembled, but her voice was firm, calling upon the ancient forces that had been tied to his bloodline for centuries. "We're so close," she whispered, her eyes flicking toward the king. "Just a little more." But the vampire king could feel the darkness stirring, fighting back. The presence of the witch, the one who had cursed his bloodline, seemed to fill the room. The temperature dropped, the air thick with her malignant energy. Her voice echoed through the room, distant but unmistakable. "You think you can escape me?" she hissed, her tone sharp and mocking. "You think you can break the bond that has been forged for generations?" The king's jaw clenched. He could feel her power, even now. She was reaching for him, her influence still lingering, her malice evident. But the maid's light pushed against it, a beacon of hope in the face of centuries of darkness. "You can't escape me," the witch's voice taunted. "You never will." The king's hands balled into fists, his nails biting into his palms. "I will," he growled, the strength of his resolve resonating through his words. "I will break this. For my children. For my bloodline." The room trembled, the very stones beneath their feet shaking with the power of the curse fighting back. The maid's chant grew louder, more urgent, her fingers now glowing with a blinding light. "Focus," she urged, her voice shaking but determined. "We must sever the bond. We can't let her win." The vampire king closed his eyes, forcing himself to concentrate, to push through the overwhelming power of the witch's influence. He could hear the sound of his own heartbeat, steady and strong. He had lived for centuries, seen countless battles, faced innumerable enemies, but nothing had ever felt quite like this. This was a battle for his family, for the future of his children. The room was growing colder, the witch's presence closing in around them like a vice. He could feel her claws digging into his mind, pulling at his thoughts. But he couldn't allow it. He couldn't let her win. "I am stronger than you," he whispered, the words barely audible, but filled with certainty. With every ounce of his strength, he pushed back against the witch's magic. And, for the first time in centuries, he felt it. A crack in the curse. A small, fragile crack, but it was there. The witch's voice faltered, her presence weakening as the king's resolve solidified. "You can't," she hissed. "You can't defeat me. I am eternal." But the king's will was stronger. He reached out, his hands glowing with power, and he could feel the magic shifting, the curse unraveling. The maid's chant reached a fever pitch, the light surrounding her blinding, filling the room with warmth. The cold, oppressive darkness began to retreat. The witch's hold was slipping. "It's working," the maid gasped, her voice filled with awe. "We're breaking it. We're breaking the curse." The king stepped forward, his body trembling with the effort of holding the magic. "At bay? We won't stop until it's done," he said, his voice low but resolute. The walls of the chamber trembled, the ancient stone beginning to crack. The witch's voice rose again, a final, desperate scream. "No," she shrieked. "You cannot defeat me. I am the source. I am the power." But her words were growing weaker, drowned out by the sound of the magic unraveling. The king felt the bond that had tied his family to the witch's curse finally snap. The walls shook violently, the air growing thick with the remnants of dark magic. And then, with a final, resounding crack, the curse was broken. The vampire king stumbled back, his strength giving out as the pressure in the room lifted. The maid collapsed beside him, exhausted but smiling. "It's done," she whispered, her voice trembling. The king looked at her, his eyes filled with gratitude. "You did it," he said softly. "You saved them." The maid smiled, her eyes shining with tears. "We did it," she replied, her voice filled with quiet triumph. The king looked toward his children, still lying in their beds, their faces peaceful for the first time in years. He could feel the weight of the curse lifting from them. They would wake, they would live, and they would be free. For the first time in centuries, the vampire king felt hope. True, unshakable hope. The battle was over. The curse was broken, and his family, his children, were finally free. The castle was eerily quiet in the moments following the breaking of the curse. The oppressive weight that had loomed over the vampire king for so long seemed to vanish, and in its place, an unfamiliar sense of peace filled the air. For the first time in what felt like forever, he allowed himself to breathe deeply, to relax his shoulders, to release the tension that had built up over centuries. The curse was finally broken. His children, the triplets who had been bound by the witch's magic for so long, would finally be free. The king turned to the maid, his heart swelling with gratitude and something else he had not allowed himself to feel in a long time. Hope. "You did it," he said softly, his voice heavy with emotion. The maid, exhausted but radiant, smiled faintly, her eyes bright with the same sense of triumph. "We did it," she corrected him, her voice shaky from the strain of the ritual, but full of pride. The king nodded, a silent understanding passing between them. They had both fought for this moment, and now it was theirs. But as the light of victory began to settle around them, the king's thoughts turned to his children. He moved towards their room, his footsteps echoing in the now silent halls of the castle. The maid followed closely behind him, her gaze never leaving his. When they entered the chamber where the triplets lay, the king's breath caught in his throat. For the first time in 50 years, the triplets looked peaceful. Their faces, once twisted with the pain of their paralysis, were now serene. The faintest flush of color had returned to their cheeks. Their shallow breathing had steadied, and their hands, once stiff and lifeless, were now resting gently by their sides. The king knelt beside their beds, his heart swelling with relief. "They're free," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "They're finally free." The maid stood beside him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Yes, Your Majesty. They are." The king looked at her, his gaze softening. "You've given them a chance at life, and I will never forget that." The maid bowed her head slightly, the weight of their shared victory settling over her like a warm embrace. "I only did what I was meant to do," she said quietly. But the king could see the pride in her eyes, the quiet strength she carried with her. For the first time in centuries, he realized that he had not been alone in his struggle. The maid, with her courage and her connection to the magic that had bound his family, had fought alongside him. He had underestimated her for so long, and now he saw her for who she truly was, a woman of extraordinary power, courage, and heart. The triplets began to stir in their beds, the gentle movements of their hands twitching ever so slightly. The king's heart skipped a beat. He leaned forward, his gaze fixed on them, willing them to wake. For so long, he had feared this moment would never come. But now, he was filled with hope, the anticipation of seeing his children awaken after all these years. Slowly, the eldest triplet's eyelids fluttered, and a faint breath escaped from his lips. The king's eyes widened, and he gently cupped the boy's hand in his. "Adrian," he whispered, his voice barely audible. The child's eyes opened, groggy at first, then fully, the light of life shining through them once again. The vampire king's heart soared, and he leaned closer, his voice thick with emotion. "You're awake. You're free." The boy blinked, confused for a moment, as if unsure of what was happening. Then, slowly, A smile spread across his face. "Father," he whispered, his voice hoarse but clear. "Is it really you?" The king's chest tightened with emotion. "Yes, my son. It's really me." The maid stepped forward, her eyes softening as she watched the scene unfold. She had done it. She had freed them. The other two triplets began to stir, their faces showing the same confusion, the same signs of awakening from a long, painful sleep. The king turned to them, his heart full of joy. "You're free," he repeated, his voice hoarse. The triplets began to slowly sit up, their movements tentative at first, as if they were unsure of their own strength. But with each passing moment, their confidence grew. They looked around the room, their gazes meeting the king's, and then the maid's. The king could see the questions in their eyes. What had happened? How had they been freed? But for now, there were no words needed. The relief on their faces was enough. The king's gaze met the maid's once more, and he gave her a silent nod of thanks. She had done more than she could ever understand. She had not only freed his children, but had given him hope, a feeling he thought he had lost forever. As the triplets slowly got to their feet, the king stood tall, feeling a weight lift from his chest. There was still much to be done. The witch's curse may have been broken, but the scars it left on his family would take time to heal. But for now, in this moment, the king allowed himself to feel the joy of what had been achieved. His family was whole again, and they would be free. The king looked to his children and then to the maid, his heart full. "Thank you," he said, his voice strong and filled with gratitude. "You have given us a new beginning." And with that, the king knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, as a family. The vampire king stood at the foot of the bed, his gaze fixed on his three children, each of them slowly adjusting to their newfound freedom. The light that had once been absent from their eyes was now returned, and their faces, once filled with the sorrow of a lifetime trapped in immobility, now reflected the warmth of life itself. It was a sight he had longed for, but even now, as the initial wave of relief passed over him, he couldn't shake the weight of what had happened. The curse was broken, yes, but their lives had been altered in ways that could never be undone. As the triplets began to sit up and stretch their limbs, their eyes meeting his with confusion and wonder, the king could feel the bond between them growing stronger. These were his children, flesh and blood, heirs to his throne. But they were also victims of the curse, and that burden was something they would have to carry, no matter how much they had been freed. The maid stood by his side, her presence a quiet comfort to him. She had done more than he could have ever asked, more than anyone could have imagined. Without her, the triplets would have remained bound to their fate, and the curse would still be poisoning their family. The king turned to her, his eyes softening. "You've done more than I could ever repay," he said quietly, his voice low with gratitude. She smiled faintly, but there was a hint of sadness in her eyes. "I did it because it was the right thing to do, Your Majesty. I never expected anything in return." He reached out, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. "You've given me a chance at something I thought I had lost forever, hope," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "And for that, I will forever be in your debt." The maid's expression softened, her lips curling into a faint smile. "You don't owe me anything," she whispered. "I only did what I was meant to do." The king nodded, but his gaze shifted back to the triplets. They were sitting up now, their movements still a bit slow but filled with wonder. The eldest triplet, Adrian, turned to his father, his face filled with confusion. "Father, what happened?" he asked, his voice hoarse, still weak from the years of silence. The king took a step forward, his heart swelling with pride and love. "You were cursed, my son," he said softly. "You and your siblings. But that curse has been broken. You are free now." Adrian's eyes widened, and he looked over at his brothers and sister, who were beginning to stir as well. "Free?" he repeated, as if the word itself was foreign to him. The king nodded, his eyes soft. "Yes, free. You can live your lives now, without the curse that bound you." The triplets exchanged looks, their expressions filled with uncertainty. "But why did we not know?" The second triplet, Valerian, asked, his voice quiet. "Why was everything so dark?" The king's gaze softened as he knelt beside them, placing a hand on Valerian's shoulder. "You were kept in the dark, trapped in your own bodies by the magic of the curse," he explained gently. "But now that magic is gone. You're no longer bound by it." The third triplet, Celine, looked up at her father with a mixture of awe and fear. "Will we be different now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The king smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "You are still the same," he said reassuringly. "You are my children, and nothing will change that. But the world will be different for you now. You'll have the chance to live, to experience things you never could before." Adrian, who had been quiet up until now, reached for his father's hand. "And we'll be safe, father? The curse can't hurt us again." The king's eyes darkened slightly, his jaw tightening. "The curse is gone," he said firmly. "But there will always be dangers in this world. There are those who would want to use you, control you. But I will protect you, always." The triplets nodded, each of them processing the weight of their father's words. The maid, who had been standing quietly in the background, stepped forward. "They're not alone anymore," she said softly. "You're not alone anymore." The king looked at her, his gaze filled with unspoken gratitude. She had been their protector when he could not be, and now, she was an integral part of their family's future. He gave a small nod, acknowledging the unspoken bond between them. "No," he said quietly. "We're not alone." As the triplets slowly rose to their feet, the king watched them with pride. They were his children, strong, resilient, and now free. And he would do everything in his power to ensure they never had to endure the pain of the curse again. The maid stood beside him, her presence a silent support, a reminder of what they had accomplished together. And as the triplets began to walk around the room, testing their limbs for the first time in years, the king felt a glimmer of hope for the future. They had faced the darkness, and together, they had won. Now, it was time to rebuild, to create a future where the shadow of the curse would never again darken their lives. And he would be there, every step of the way, to ensure that their lives would be filled with light, love, and freedom. The days that followed were filled with a new sense of peace that the vampire king had not known in centuries. His children, once bound by the curse, were now free, their limbs moving with the fluidity of life, their faces no longer contorted in the agony of their paralysis. Adrian, Valerian, and Celine were walking, laughing, and speaking again, their voices filling the castle with a sound that had long been absent. The king watched them with a quiet sense of pride, each step they took symbolizing not just their freedom, but his triumph over a darkness that had haunted his family for generations. The maid, standing beside him as she had in the past days, observed the children with a gentle smile. She had done more than anyone could ever have expected, and her connection to the family had grown deeper than either of them could have anticipated. Yet, despite the joy that filled the castle, the king knew that their journey was far from over. The curse had been broken, yes, but the darkness that had once consumed his children had left its marks on their souls. They were free, but they still needed to find a way to live without the constant weight of the past hanging over them. He turned to the maid, his gaze softening. "They're adjusting well," he said, his voice filled with gratitude. "They've been through so much." The maid nodded, her eyes never leaving the triplets as they played in the distance. "They are strong," she said quietly. "And now, they have the chance to find themselves again." The king glanced at her, his thoughts drifting back to the moment they had broken the curse. The magic had been overwhelming, the witch's dark presence still lingering in the air long after her influence had waned. He could feel it even now, a faint echo in the back of his mind, reminding him that there were still forces at play that they had not fully understood. He had hoped that by breaking the curse, the past would be put to rest. But he had learned in his centuries of life that no victory was ever as clean as it seemed. The witch's magic is gone, but there are others who will want to take advantage of our weakness, the king said, his voice hardening. "We can't let our guard down." The maid met his gaze, her expression serious. "We won't," she replied firmly. "We've already faced the greatest danger. Whatever comes next, we'll face it together." He nodded, feeling the weight of her words. The bond between them had grown stronger, more than just that of a king and a servant. It was something deeper now, forged through shared trials and triumphs. "Together," he echoed. As the days passed, the king and the maid worked side by side, ensuring that the triplets were well cared for, that they were given every opportunity to heal from the trauma they had endured. The triplets, now beginning to experience the world for the first time in years, were curious, joyful, and full of life. They asked questions about their past, about the curse that had held them captive, but the king could only offer them fragments of answers. The truth was still too painful for him to fully articulate. As for the maid, she had become an irreplaceable part of their lives. The triplets had grown fond of her, and the king found that he too had begun to depend on her in ways he had never expected. She was no longer just a servant to him. She was someone who had earned his trust and respect. One evening, as they sat together in the garden watching the stars, the king turned to the maid. "You've given them everything," he said softly. "And now, you've given me something I thought I had lost. A future." She smiled, but there was sadness in her eyes. "I've only given them the chance to live. The rest, it's up to them." The king's heart ached as he looked at her. He could see the weight of her own past in her eyes, the burdens she had carried for so long. He knew that she, too, had been marked by the curse, though in a different way. "What happens now?" the king asked, his voice low, unsure of what the future would hold for them. The maid turned her gaze to the horizon, her expression thoughtful. "Now we live," she said simply. "We rebuild. We give the triplets the life they deserve. And we create a new future, one free from the shadows of the past." The king felt a sense of peace settle over him, a feeling he hadn't known in centuries. They had faced the darkest of trials and emerged victorious. And now, they had a chance to build something new, something that was theirs alone. The castle, once a place of sorrow and confinement, was now filled with laughter and light. The triplets were finding their place in the world, and the king knew that, with the maid by his side, they would all find their way forward. But as he sat there in the garden, watching the stars twinkle above, the king knew that their journey was far from over. There were still dangers lurking in the shadows, still forces that would seek to undo the peace they had fought so hard to create. But no matter what came their way, the king was certain of one thing. Together, they would face it. And together, they would triumph. The days after the curse was broken were filled with uncertainty and change, but also with the slow, steady rhythm of a new beginning. The castle, once a place of sorrow and isolation, was now alive with the sounds of laughter and footsteps echoing through its grand halls. The triplets, who had spent so long in their own silent world, were now experiencing the world around them in full color, their movements becoming more confident with each passing day. The vampire king stood in the heart of the castle, watching them as they ran across the courtyard, their faces filled with wonder. His heart swelled with pride, but also with a quiet ache. He had been so focused on their freedom, on breaking the curse, that he had not yet fully considered what it meant for them to live in the world again. What would they make of this newfound freedom? What would they become? He was still learning to navigate his own emotions after all these years, and now, he found himself navigating theirs. The maid, standing beside him, could sense his thoughts without him speaking. She had always known him so well, seen the burdens he carried. She looked at him, her eyes soft but filled with understanding. "They are finding their way," she said gently. "And so will you, Your Majesty." He glanced at her, her words grounding him in the present. The maid had been more than just a caretaker. She had become a part of his life in ways he had never expected. He had trusted her with his children's lives, with their future, and in return, she had given him the chance to be a father again. A part of him still felt like he didn't deserve the peace they had found. The weight of centuries of loss and regret still lingered in the corners of his mind, but with each passing day, he found it easier to breathe, easier to let go of the past. "I don't know what comes next," he admitted, his voice quiet. "But I know I want them to have everything. I want them to live without fear." The maid gave him a reassuring smile. "They will, and you will be there for them, just as you always have." She stepped closer, her voice softening. "The curse may have been broken, but the journey of healing is just beginning. You can't carry the weight of their past forever, Your Majesty. Let them find their way, just as you are finding yours." The king's heart tightened at her words. It was true. He had spent so long trying to protect them, to shield them from the pain they had endured, but now, they were free to live their lives. He had to let go, to trust that they would be okay. The maid's presence was a constant reminder that he was not alone in this. They were in this together, navigating the unknown together. As the days turned into weeks, the triplets began to embrace their new reality. Adrian, once the quiet, reserved child, began to show signs of leadership, taking charge of small tasks. Around the castle, Valerian, With his inquisitive nature, spent hours exploring the library, eager to learn about the world that had been denied to him for so long. And Celine, the youngest, blossomed into a confident young girl, her laughter filling the halls of the castle. The Vampire King watched them with a mixture of awe and pride. They were strong, capable, and eager to learn. They were becoming their own people, no longer defined by the curse that had once held them captive. But even as they grew, the king could not ignore the lingering presence of the witch. The curse may have been broken, but there were still remnants of her power scattered throughout the kingdom. The king knew that they had to be vigilant, that the fight was not yet over. As night fell, he gathered the triplets in the great hall, the flickering candlelight casting shadows on the walls. "There are still dangers out there," he said, his voice steady but filled with resolve. "But we will face them together. You are no longer children trapped by a curse. You are my heirs, and it is time for you to learn how to protect this kingdom." The triplets listened intently, their faces serious. They were ready. Adrian, the eldest, stepped forward. "We've been given a chance at a new life. We will not waste it, father," he said, his voice strong. The king's heart swelled with pride. His children were no longer the fragile, helpless souls they had once been. They were warriors in their own right, ready to fight for their future. The maid stood by the king's side, watching the scene unfold. She had seen the transformation in the triplets, and she knew that they would not only survive, but thrive. The kingdom was no longer a place of darkness and fear. It was a place of hope, of growth, and of new beginnings. "Together, we will build something stronger than any curse," the king said, his voice filled with conviction. "We will create a future that is ours to shape." As the triplets nodded in agreement, the Vampire King felt a sense of peace wash over him. They had come so far, and yet, he knew their journey was just beginning. The road ahead would not always be easy, but with the maid by his side, and with the strength of his children, he was ready to face whatever came their way. For the first time in centuries, the Vampire King allowed himself to believe in the future, in a future that was no longer defined by pain and darkness, but by hope, strength, and love. The castle had never felt more alive. The sounds of laughter and footsteps filled the halls, and the once empty rooms were now filled with purpose. The triplets, no longer trapped by the curse that had bound them for so long, had embraced their new lives with an energy the king had never seen before. Their days were filled with learning, exploring, and growing into the people they were meant to be. And yet, despite the joy that filled the castle, there was an unease that lingered in the air. The king could feel it, the weight of what had come before and the uncertainty of what was to come. The witch's magic may have been broken, but the threat of other dark forces was never far behind. He had learned that even in moments of peace, danger could rise when least expected. The king stood in his study, looking out over the vast grounds of the castle. His mind was racing, thinking of the future and the dangers that might still lurk in the shadows. He had spent so many years fighting for his family, protecting them from a curse that seemed endless. And now, after all the pain and struggle, they were free. But were they truly safe? The maid entered the room, her presence a quiet comfort to him. She had been by his side through it all, offering her strength when he needed it most. She was no longer just a caretaker, but a trusted ally, someone who had fought beside him to break the curse. She could see the worry in his eyes. "You're thinking about what comes next," she said softly, her voice gentle but filled with understanding. The king sighed, his shoulders heavy with the weight of responsibility. "I should be thinking about the future," he said quietly. "But it's hard to shake the feeling that something is still out there, waiting." The maid nodded, her gaze thoughtful. "The world may be at peace now, but the magic of the curse was powerful. There are always forces that will try to rise up when the balance is disturbed." The king turned to her, his expression filled with resolve. "I won't let anything happen to my children. They've been through enough already." She smiled at him, a soft and reassuring smile that brought him some peace. "They are strong. And so are you." The king's eyes softened as he looked at her. The maid had always been a quiet strength in his life, but now, she was more than that. She had become a part of his family, someone he trusted implicitly. He could no longer imagine facing the challenges ahead without her by his side. "I don't know what the future holds," the king said, his voice filled with a new sense of purpose. "But I do know one thing. We will face it together." The maid's smile widened, and she stepped forward, standing beside him as they both looked out over the castle grounds. The triplets were outside, their laughter echoing in the distance as they played together, free for the first time in their lives. Together, she echoed softly. As the days turned into weeks, the king found himself turning his attention to matters of the kingdom. The curse had been broken, but the balance of power in the realm was still fragile. There were still those who would seek to undermine his rule, to reclaim the throne for themselves. But the king knew that he was not alone in this fight. He had the maid, his children, and his allies by his side. And together, they would ensure that the kingdom remained strong. But even as the king focused on rebuilding and securing the future of his realm, his thoughts kept returning to the triplets. They had been through so much, and now that they were free, he couldn't help but wonder what their future would look like. Adrian, Valerian, and Celine were no longer the fragile children they had once been. They were growing stronger each day, their minds sharp and their spirits determined. But they were still young, still learning about the world they had been denied for so long. The king knew that the path ahead would not be easy for them. They would face challenges, both from within the kingdom and from outside forces. But he also knew that they were ready. They were his children, and they had inherited his strength, his resolve, and his will to protect those they loved. One evening, the king gathered the triplets in the grand hall, the flickering candlelight casting long shadows on the walls. The maid stood by his side, watching as the children took their seats around the table. "It is time for you to begin your training," the king said, his voice steady and filled with purpose. "You are not just heirs to this throne. You are the future of this kingdom, and it is your responsibility to ensure that it remains strong, safe, and free." The triplets exchanged looks, their faces serious as they took in their father's words. "We're ready, father," Adrian said, his voice filled with determination. "We've been waiting for this." The king nodded, pride swelling in his chest. His children were no longer the broken souls they had once been. They were strong, capable, and eager to step into their roles as rulers of the kingdom. The maid placed a hand on the king's shoulder, her presence a quiet comfort as they both watched the triplets prepare for their training. It was a new beginning for all of them, a chance to build a future that was no longer defined by the curse, but by their strength and unity. The road ahead would not be without its obstacles, but the king was no longer afraid. With his children at his side, with the maid by his side, there was nothing they could not face. Together, they would shape the future of the kingdom, and together, they would ensure that it would be a future built on hope, strength, and love. The days following the king's declaration to train his children were filled with a new sense of purpose. The once quiet castle now buzzed with activity as the triplets, Adrian, Valerian, and Celine, began their training in earnest. The vampire king watched them carefully, observing their progress with a mixture of pride and concern. They had been freed from the curse, but the world they now faced was vast and filled with complexities they had never known. Adrian, the eldest, was quick to grasp the strategies and leadership skills his father had begun to teach him. His confidence grew with each passing day, and he carried himself with the quiet authority of someone who understood the weight of responsibility. Valerian, ever curious, threw himself into studying the kingdom's history and politics. He would spend hours in the library, his mind racing with new information, always eager to learn more. But it was Celine, the youngest, who had the most difficult time adjusting. She was strong-willed and fearless, but the idea of stepping into a world that had been closed off to her for so long was overwhelming. The king saw this struggle in her, and it broke his heart to see the uncertainty in her eyes. He knew she was capable, but she needed time. And so, he gave her time. The maid, ever by his side, also observed the triplets' training, and though her heart swelled with pride, she too knew the road ahead would not be easy. She had seen the triplets grow stronger with each day, but she knew the challenges they would face were far from over. The kingdom had changed since the curse was broken, and there were those who would seek to destabilize it, to take advantage of the power vacuum left behind by the curse. The king had been a ruler in isolation, focused solely on the well-being of his children. But now, with the triplets growing into their roles, the kingdom needed more than just protection. It needed to thrive. As the days passed, the king's gaze shifted from his children to the future of the realm. It was no longer enough to simply defend the kingdom. It was time to rebuild. He needed allies. He needed to strengthen the kingdom's position in the world, and he needed to ensure that the forces of darkness that had once threatened his family would never return. One evening, as the sun set over the distant mountains, the king called his children to the great hall. They stood before him, their faces filled with determination, yet there was still the lingering uncertainty in Celine's eyes. The king could feel the weight of his words as he spoke. "We've come a long way, my children," he began, his voice steady. "But this kingdom is still fragile. There are those who would seek to undo everything we've worked for." He paused, meeting each of their gazes in turn. "Your training is only the beginning. You must be prepared to protect not just this castle, but the people of this realm. You must learn how to lead with strength, with wisdom, and with compassion." Adrian nodded, his jaw set. He was ready. Valerian, always the thinker, seemed to weigh his father's words carefully. Celine, however, stood still, her fists clenched at her sides. She was afraid, the king could see that clearly. But there was something in her, a fire that had yet to fully ignite. And it was that fire that the king would nurture. "Father, we will not fail you," Adrian said, his voice full of resolve. "We'll do whatever it takes to protect this kingdom." The king smiled, his pride in his children evident. "I know you will," he said. "But remember, strength alone is not enough. You must know when to fight and when to seek peace. A true ruler understands the balance between power and mercy." Valerian spoke up, his voice thoughtful. "And what of the threats from outside the kingdom? The ones we cannot control?" The king's smile faded slightly as he turned his gaze to the horizon. "We will face those as they come. But the most dangerous threat is not always the one you can see. It is the one that works in the shadows, the one that seeks to turn allies into enemies. We must remain vigilant." Celine stepped forward then, her voice quiet but firm. "What do you need us to do?" The king looked at his youngest child, his heart swelling with pride. "I need you to trust in yourselves, trust in each other, and know that no matter what, we face this together." That evening, the triplets began their most difficult training yet. They spent hours with their father, learning the art of diplomacy, of understanding the complexities of the world beyond the castle walls. The king knew that it was not enough to simply teach them how to fight. They needed to understand the world in its entirety, to see the kingdom as more than just a place to rule, but a realm to protect and nurture. The maid watched from a distance, her heart filled with both pride and worry. She had seen the triplets grow in strength, but she knew that the real test was yet to come. The forces of darkness that had once controlled their lives were not easily defeated. They had merely been broken for now, and there would always be those who would seek to reclaim their power. But the king had shown her that with unity, with family, they could overcome anything. And for the first time in many years, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, peace was possible. The days grew shorter as the triplets continued their training, but the sense of hope in the castle remained. The vampire king's confidence in his children grew each day, as did the bond between them. He knew that they were ready, that they would face the challenges ahead with strength, wisdom, and love. Together, they would rebuild the kingdom, and together, they would ensure that the darkness that once threatened to tear them apart would never return. As the days passed, the vampire king felt the weight of the responsibility settle in once again. His children were no longer the helpless beings trapped by the curse, but now, they were stepping into their roles as heirs to the throne. He had taught them the basics of leadership, strategy, and diplomacy, but now came the hardest lesson: understanding the complex web of power and alliances that held the kingdom together. The world outside their castle walls had changed, but so had the kingdom itself. As the triplets grew into their new roles, their education expanded, and the challenges became more real. Adrian, the eldest, found himself wrestling with the decision-making that came with authority. Valerian, the second, was relentless in his study of history and law, but he had yet to fully understand the cost of wielding power. And Celine, the youngest, still struggled with her place in this world. She had the heart of a warrior, but she lacked the confidence to wield it. The king watched his children grow, and with each passing day, he felt the weight of their future pressing on him. The decisions they would make would shape the kingdom for generations to come. He could feel it, the burden of their legacy. There was one thing, however, that gave him hope. His children were not alone in this. The maid, who had been by his side since the beginning, had become not just an ally, but a true partner in this journey. She had been there every step of the way, her strength and wisdom guiding them through the darkest of times. She had seen the potential in the triplets long before he had. She had known that they were more than the sum of their past. One evening, as the king walked through the castle's gardens, deep in thought, he was joined by the maid. She had a way of knowing when he needed space and when he needed guidance. Tonight, she simply stood beside him, letting the quiet of the evening settle around them. Finally, she spoke. "You are worried," she said softly, not a question, but an observation. The king nodded, looking out over the gardens, his eyes distant. "They are ready, but I'm not sure I am. I've been holding on to so much, for so long. The curse, the throne, my responsibility, it's all coming to a head." The maid's gaze was gentle but firm. "You don't have to carry it all alone, Your Majesty. They are your children, and they are ready to step into their own. They've learned so much, not just from you, but from each other. They are stronger than you think." The king sighed, a deep, weary breath. "I know, but what if I've missed something? What if I failed them?" The maid placed a hand on his arm, her touch warm and reassuring. "You haven't failed them. You've given them a foundation to stand on, a future to look forward to. Now, it's up to them to build on it. And you will be there, not as a ruler, but as their father, supporting them every step of the way." The king looked at her, his eyes softening with gratitude. "I don't know where I would be without you," he said quietly. "You've been more than just a protector for my children. You've helped me see beyond the darkness." The maid smiled, her eyes filled with quiet strength. "We are all part of this journey, Your Majesty. No one can walk it alone." The king nodded, feeling the weight on his shoulders ease just slightly. As he stood there, watching the stars beginning to emerge in the night sky, he realized something profound. For the first time in a long while, he was not afraid of the future. The triplets, though still young, were ready to take on the challenges of the world. They had the strength to lead, to protect, and to create a new future for the kingdom. And he, as their father, would be there to guide them, just as the maid had guided him. The journey ahead would not be easy, but it would be theirs to shape. Together, they would rebuild the kingdom from the ashes of the past, and the king knew, without a doubt, that they would succeed. The next morning, the king called the triplets to his study, his voice firm but filled with warmth. "The time has come," he said, as they gathered around him. "You've learned the skills you need to lead this kingdom, but now it's time for you to prove that you are ready. You will go out into the realm, meet the people, and begin building relationships with our allies and our enemies alike. You must show the world that you are the future of this kingdom." Adrian stepped forward first, his eyes determined. "We're ready, father," he said. Valerian nodded, his mind already working through the strategy of the journey. And Celine, though still hesitant, stood tall, her resolve solidifying. "We won't let you down," she said, her voice steady. The king looked at them with pride, his heart swelling. "I know you won't," he said. "Remember, this kingdom is yours now. Lead with strength, with wisdom, and with kindness. And know that you have a family who will always be by your side." The triplets stood together, ready to take on the world. The king knew their journey was just beginning, and he was filled with a quiet hope. The curse was broken, but a new chapter had only just begun. The future of the kingdom was in their hands, and together, they would build a new era, one defined by hope, unity, and the strength of a family who had overcome the darkness. The journey of rebuilding the kingdom had only just begun. The vampire king, now with a renewed sense of hope, watched his children take the first steps into a world that was no longer bound by darkness. Adrian, Valerian, and Celine had grown into capable leaders, each carrying their own unique strengths. They were no longer the children who had been trapped by the curse. They were young adults ready to face the world. The castle, once a symbol of pain and isolation, had transformed into a home filled with life and possibility. The triplets, under their father's guidance, began to learn what it meant to rule with wisdom and compassion. Adrian, with his calm and decisive nature, began to take on more responsibilities, learning how to manage the affairs of the kingdom. Valerian, ever curious, dove into the study of diplomacy and alliances, determined to build bridges with neighboring realms. And Celine, once unsure of herself, found strength in her ability to connect with others, her courage and empathy making her a natural leader in her own right. The king watched them, his heart full of pride, but he knew their work was far from finished. There would be challenges ahead, challenges that would test their resolve and their unity. The world outside the castle walls had not forgotten the darkness that once plagued the royal family, and there were still enemies lurking, waiting for the right moment to strike. But the king was no longer afraid. He had his children by his side, and together they would protect the kingdom they had rebuilt. One evening, as the sun set behind the mountains, the king stood on the balcony of his chamber, looking out over the land. The soft breeze ruffled his hair, and for the first time in centuries, he felt at peace. The maid, now his closest confidant, stood beside him. She had been there through it all, from the darkest moments to the brightest victories. Together, they had broken the curse, and now, together, they would face whatever came next. They've grown so much, the king said quietly, his voice filled with awe. I never imagined they would come so far. The maid nodded, her gaze focused on the triplets as they laughed and talked in the courtyard below. They are ready, she replied, her voice warm with pride. They have their father's strength and their own unique gifts. They will lead this kingdom with honor. The king smiled, his eyes never leaving his children. I couldn't have done it without you, he said, his voice filled with gratitude. The maid turned to him, her expression soft. We did it together, she said. And now, we watch them build a future. The king nodded, feeling the weight of his responsibilities lighten. His children were no longer the fragile beings they once were. They were leaders in their own right, ready to take on the world. And with the maid by his side, he knew they would be unstoppable. As the night deepened, the triplets joined them on the balcony, their faces glowing with excitement. Father, Adrian said, his voice full of determination. We've received word from the neighboring kingdom. They want to meet with us. It's time to start forging alliances. The king turned to face his son, his heart swelling with pride. Then it's time to make our move, he said. We'll meet them with open arms and show them the strength of our kingdom. Valerian stepped forward, his eyes bright with curiosity. And we'll be ready for whatever challenges they bring, Father. We won't back down. The king smiled, feeling the weight of his family's support. Together, he said, his voice filled with conviction. We face the future together. The triplets nodded in agreement, their resolve as strong as their father's. The kingdom was theirs to protect, to build, and to lead into a new era. As the vampire king looked at his children, he knew that they would rise to the challenges ahead. They had already overcome so much, and now, with the strength of their unity, they would face whatever the future held. For the first time in his long life, the vampire king felt a sense of peace and hope that no darkness could ever take away. The curse was broken, the past was behind them, and a new chapter in their lives had begun. Together, they would forge a future built on strength, love, and the unbreakable bond of family.